of the Scriptures. The same night, Jacob, this is who we're talking about, Jacob, he got up, he took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the world. Amen. Thanks be to God. Church, Genesis 32 is one of the most critical, most important linchpins of the Hebrew Bible and the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. My hope and my prayer today is that that becomes apparent, that this little story about Jacob wrestling with someone all night long sets the stage for so much of the rest of the Scriptures. But before we can jump into today's scene, let's lay things out a little bit so we can understand what's happening here. We're picking up kind of in the middle of a story. Genesis 32 is not Genesis 1 or Genesis 10 or Genesis 25. We're kind of picking up in the middle of Jacob's story. A whole lot has happened to get us to the ford of the Jabbok. Do you know anyone that always seems to be getting into fights? Like they just can't help themselves. They just fight with people a lot. I know people like that, and I'm like, okay, isn't it tiring to fight all the time? Aren't you exhausted? But some people, they just have this unquenchable knack for fighting, and that's Jacob. If you want to know who Jacob is, he's a dude who cannot help himself. From day one, brother has been fighting. Quite literally. Because he got the name Jacob because he is a heel grabber. When he was born, the younger brother of 2 twins, he came out of the womb grabbing his brother's heel. He's always been fighting with his brother Esau since the day they were born. Throughout his life, Jacob and Esau have had fierce competition, constant competition, always trying to one-up each other, to take something that doesn't belong to them. For example, the perfect example of this, Jacob tricked his father, Isaac. He stole the birthright, the blessing that was supposed to go to his older brother, Esau. Isn't it a little unfair that you're born 1 minute before your brother and you get all the birthright? Are you really an older brother if you're born 30 seconds apart from each other? I can only imagine that's what Jacob thought as he was wrestling with, why does Esau get the blessing? Why does Esau get the birthright and I get nothing? Or I get only a quarter of it. And so he tricked his father. He dressed up like his brother Esau. And when Isaac found out that he had been tricked, what is so incredible, Isaac was upset. His father was upset. But you know what he did? Nothing. He did not rescind the blessing. He said, well, I gave him the blessing. I guess he's blessed. And Esau, you're going to now serve your younger brother. And for this, perpetually, Esau hated Jacob. Esau was not happy with his brother. But Jacob didn't only fight with Esau, he fought with other people too. He went to live with his uncle's family, his uncle Laban, and that's where he took 2 wives, even though Laban kind of tricked Jacob into marrying someone who he did not expect to marry. And so Jacob then responded to Laban by tricking him into giving Jacob the best of Laban's flock. Jacob deceived his uncle Laban, and Jacob grew in wealth, and Laban didn't. Jacob stole the best of Laban's flock. He deceived him, and things did not end well with Laban. But To make matters worse, this is after this decades-long feud with his brother. Now that Jacob has 2 wives and 11 children, he receives word that his brother from the north, Esau, is coming with, and it says in the verses immediately preceding what we read today, he's coming with 400. He was coming with 400. And that 400 is an interesting reference. The number 400 is most likely not a literal number, but it's referencing something particular in the context. It means that Esau is coming for Jacob with not just his family. If he was coming to Jacob with just his family, then it would be in a multiple of 10. It would be he's coming with 30 or he's coming with 50. Then that would mean I'm coming with my family. If it was the thousands, it would be if he's coming with 4,000, then it would be he's coming with the clan. With the tribe, the entirety of the tribe, all of the tribe. But if it's multiples of hundreds of people, that represents something, and it means he's coming with the clan. Not merely the family, not the entire tribe, but his clan. Jacob is concerned because is Esau coming with 400 to reconcile or to fight? Is he coming for reconciliation or for retribution? Jacob does not know. And so what does Jacob do? Well, he has all these riches that he deceived from his uncle Laban, and so he sends these gifts off to his brother before he arrives. He doesn't know what's going to happen, and so he sends gifts ahead of his family, trying to appease his potentially angry older brother. And as they are fleeing, they find themselves at a river's edge, which, if you're in battle, that's a dangerous place to be. Anybody who's been in the military knows that one of the most dangerous things you can do is crossing a river. Even today, even in modern times, crossing a river is a dangerous place to be in battle. He's being pursued by his older brother. He doesn't know what's going to happen, and so he does something interesting. He sends his whole family across the river, his 2 wives, his 2 maids, his 11 children. Y'all go across the river, and what does he do? He doubles back. You guys go on up ahead. I'm going to hang out here for a minute. He sends them across, but he stays behind. Is this a move of bravery? Does Jacob show, for once, a little fortitude in his life? Sending them across safely so that he can potentially speak to his brother alone and intercede so that his family is not sacrificed? Or is it the more cowardly behavior that we've seen Jacob express throughout his life? Does he send them across so that, should worse come to worse, at least he will not be slaughtered with his family? Well, the answer to that question, we will never know. The scriptures do not tell us, but what we do know is that he doubled back. He did not cross that river. He did not go across the ford of the Jabbok, and that's significant. More on that in a little bit. But here we have Jacob alone at the ford of the Jabbok, or at least he thinks he's alone. In season 5, episode 2 of Star Trek: The Next Generation, Captain Picard finds himself marooned on a planet with the captain of an alien vessel, a ship with people for whom we cannot communicate. Oh, and by the way, on this planet, there's a monster trying to kill them. An electric monster, of all things. And I will say this is probably my favorite episode of The Next Generation, Star Trek: The Next Generation. And it has been categorized by Star Trek experts as one of the top 10 of all time. So I'm in good company there. But when I would watch Star Trek, if I could be honest, I would get a little bit frustrated. I'm not a linguist by any stretch of the imagination, but I would get frustrated when I watched Star Trek because I thought, how can they communicate with everyone perfectly? The answer to that, of course, is they have universal translators. Now, I'm not a linguist. I've studied language a little bit, not a whole lot. But here's what I know about other languages. Even if the words are being translated in real time, the sentence structure is not always the same in every language. I challenge you to go translate some German and find out that the subject of the sentence is the very last word. And it makes no sense. It makes no sense. And the verb is like, it lasts for 5 sentences. There's like one action for multiple sentences. It makes no sense. So when I would watch Star Trek, I would be frustrated because they would be talking and it would be in perfect American English syntax. The sentence structure was all the same. And I was like, that's not how languages work. And then season 5, episode 2 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This episode called Dharmic. I was pleasantly surprised that the universal translators didn't work. They could not do what they were supposed to do because this particular alien race, the Tamarians, well, they only spoke in metaphor and allegory. They didn't speak in sentences like we do. They spoke in references to events that happened in their lifetime as a way to illustrate what was happening in that moment. The example that was given over and over again throughout this episode. If you know it, say it with me. Dharmic and Jalad at Tanagra. You know what that means? Neither did Captain Picard. The Tamarian captain was saying that the experience that they had on this planet was allegorical to what had happened with a gentleman named Dharmic and a gentleman named Jalad at a place called Tanagra. Except Captain Picard didn't know who Dharmic or Jalad or what or where Tanagra was. So these allegorical phrases weave their way throughout the episode, and Captain Picard has to figure out what he is saying when he's saying things like Shaka, when the walls fell, which was a way to say this was a failure. Or when the captain would say Timba, his arms wide. An allegory for giving and receiving, referencing these specific events as a way to communicate a story that was allegorical to what they were experiencing. And I'll be honest, every time I read the story of Jacob in Genesis chapter 32, wrestling with this divine being at a place called Peniel at the ford of the Jabbok, I cannot help but think of this episode of Star Trek and the allegorical way of speaking. When I read this story in Genesis 32, I just want to say when I read it, Jacob and El at the ford of the Jabbok. El, by the way, is the word for God in Hebrew that's used here. Jacob and El at the ford of the Jabbok. Because when I say that, we all know what I'm referencing, right? Or Jacob, his hip out of socket. Or Jacob become Israel. And while we believe that these events are real, they are also, I believe, for us allegories about what it means to be faithful to God. I hope we can read Genesis 32 and put ourselves into the story. Dharmic and Jalad at Tanagra? Well, maybe Jacob and El at the ford of the Jabbok. So let me ask you, have you ever wrestled with God? You ever had a divine wrestling match? Now, in this text, we don't know who this spiritual person Jacob encounters is. The text doesn't tell us definitively, but what we know is that Jacob, when he stops at the ford of the Jabbok, is encountered immediately by a man who wrestles him until daybreak. And the text says he is a spiritual person. This spiritual person could be an angel of the Lord, maybe the angel that gets referenced over and over again throughout the Old Testament. Maybe, some have argued, it could even be the Word of God made flesh. The person who walked with Adam and Eve in the garden. We don't know, but the text says that Jacob encountered a spiritual person who he believed was God, who at the minimum represented El, God, to Jacob. And Jacob is alone and in the dark and is confronted by God. And God knows Jacob. God knows that Jacob has been a liar. God knows that Jacob has been a deceiver. God knows that Jacob has been the heel grabber. His character is rather conniving and manipulative. God knows Jacob, and God knows Jacob's failures. And God fights with Jacob. God wrestles with Jacob. God fights with Jacob because, listen to this, church, God is fighting for Jacob. God fights with Jacob because God is fighting for Jacob. You ever fought with someone because you're fighting for them? Husbands and wives, sometimes when you're fighting with one another, what you're actually doing is fighting for your relationship, for your marriage. Parents, sometimes when you're fighting with your kids, what you're actually doing is fighting for their future. And kids, sometimes when you're fighting with your parents, what they're doing is fighting for you because they love you and want what's best for you. God confronts Jacob. He fights with Jacob. And as Jacob fights with God, God asks him, listen to this, church, what is your name? Do you know what God is asking Jacob in this overnight wrestling match? What is your name? What's in a name, Shakespeare asked in Romeo and Juliet? Well, in the Hebrew Bible, it's a lot. The scriptures disagree with Shakespeare on this one. What's in a name? A lot is in a name. When God asks Jacob, what is your name? What he's saying is, who are you? Who are you? The implication of this question is, are you the person you ought to be? Are you the person, God asks, that I created you to be? Are you who I know you can be? What is your name? What Jacob encounters at the ford of the Jabbok is what St. John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul, which is a painful yet transformative moment of divine encounter. What Jacob experiences at the ford of the Jabbok is that he cannot hide behind his deception and lies anymore. He cannot pretend like his life has not been full of brokenness and pain, both pain received and pain caused. When Jacob wrestles with God who sees him and knows him, he cannot hide anymore. When we wrestle with God, what happens is we are confronted with ourselves. There's another episode of Star Trek about that I won't reference. But the truth is, part of the reason people will avoid worship is because they're afraid of an encounter with God who sees them, who knows them, and they don't want to have to face that part of their life. Part of the reason people avoid worship is because it's too real. Because when they are confronted with a transcendent God, they know that they will be exposed. So Jacob is confronted by God. Did you know that sometimes God will confront you? Did you know that sometimes God will stand in front of you and start wrestling with you? Did you know that when you are confronted by God, you cannot hide behind the lies that you tell yourself to make yourself feel better anymore? You see, we all, if we are honest, will come to these moments of the dark night of the soul. Some of us have experienced these for sure, a place where our confrontation with God causes us to maybe finally be honest with ourselves. Because when we encounter a God who sees us and knows us, we cannot hide anymore. When we encounter God in the dark night of our souls, we are asked the question, what is your name? Who are you? As the poet and musician John Foreman asked, this is your life. Are you who you want to be? When God confronts you, you have to confront yourself. When God confronts you, you have to face your own shadows, your own shortcomings, the things that you ignore and deny and don't want to acknowledge. God will fight with you because God is fighting for you. Now, Jacob doesn't leave this fight the same way he enters it, right? Sometimes fighting with God will leave us with a limp. Jacob leaves this place walking differently. Sometimes when we wrestle with God, we are left with a mark signifying that we have engaged in this divine wrestling match, if that is, we're honest enough to engage it. Jacob, his hip out of socket. An allegory for the evidence that we have striven with God. Evidence that we have wrestled with God. But Jacob doesn't just leave with a limp, church. He leaves with a new name. What is your name? Jacob becomes Israel. Who he was, because of this divine wrestling match, isn't who he has to be. Just because Jacob was heel grabber doesn't mean he will forever be heel grabber. He is the one who will not stop wrestling with God. He will not give up the fight. You know, sometimes I think that's what it means to be faithful. What if that is what faithfulness means? Israel becomes Jacob's name, but guess what? It also becomes the identity for the people of God. It's not just his name, it is the name for those who have fidelity to Yahweh. And Paul says there is a new Israel. There are a new people who won't stop fighting. What if what it means to be faithful is not just that we have all the answers, we've got it all figured out, we do the right things, we've got it taken care of? What if faithfulness is, I'm just not going to stop fighting? I don't know all the answers, I don't have it all figured out, but I'm not going to stop wrestling. Israel. He wrestles with God. Who he was isn't who he has to be. He doesn't have to stay the heel grabber. He is now the one who will not stop wrestling with God. And this is what God does. After the dark nights of our souls, God transforms us. When God confronts Jacob, he doesn't leave him as he was. You see, Jacob becomes Israel. Simon becomes Peter. Saul becomes Paul. God fights with us because God is fighting for us, because God wants to transform us. Who we were is not who we always have to be. Transformation, I'm telling you right now, is not always a pleasant experience. It wasn't for Jacob in this moment. It wasn't for Paul. I dare say that we are not transformed without a fight. And if we ignore the fight, we might just be ignoring the transformation. I dare say that we are not made into something new without a little bit of struggle. You see, church, the good news is that God gave Jacob a new name. God gave Jacob a new identity. And when we wrestle with God, God gives us a new name, a new identity, a new way of perceiving the world. You see, Jacob was the heel grabber, he was the fighter, but his new name does not deny that fight. His new name also acknowledges he's a fighter still. Israel, he wrestles with God. But instead of being the one who fights with everyone else, Israel is instead to be the one who fights for someone else. You get that difference? The good news is that God confronts us as we are so that we don't stay as we were. God confronts us so that God can change us. I need to add a little caveat. Even at an old age. Jacob has 2 wives and 11 kids, a couple grandkids. He's no spring chicken. Maybe he didn't cross the ford of the Jabbok because it was really going to hurt his joints to get into that cold water. But even that old dog can learn a few new tricks. For what it's worth, I did a demo at our new house this week, and I am just done. Mid-30s, I guess, is where things go downhill. Even Jacob in his older age could be changed. So can we. We're never too old to be transformed by God. And so after this divine wrestling match, after receiving a new name, after the dark night of the soul at daybreak, Jacob finally crosses the ford of the Jabbok to join his family. There's almost a throwaway line at the end of our reading. I don't know if you caught it. In verse 31, it says, the sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel. That is, he crossed the river. I'm wrapping up here, but for Semitic peoples, for Hebrew folk, the crossing of a body of water, it represented something significant. The crossing, the passing, the going through death. Going into the water was a way of entering into a place of death. When people would pass through waters, they were passing through death. Think of Moses in the Red Sea. Think of the Israelites crossing the Jordan into Canaan's fair land. Before Moses and the Hebrew children can cross over into God's future for them, they have to pass through the waters. They cannot go around the Red Sea. Before the Israelites can enter the land that God has for them, they have to pass through the waters. There's no way around it. They participate in a form of death, not turning away from it, but pressing on through it. So is it for us, church. Do we want to enter into Canaan's fair land? Do we want to enter into the place that God has for us? Well, I'm telling you, you can't go around the fight. You can't avoid the hard. What Jacob reveals and what the scriptures reveal over and over and over again is that you have to go through it. But what was even more significant was that crossing a river was much more significant. Old Testament scholar Matt Tuzinski says it this way. When the water that they're crossing is a river, a source of living water, then the passage is out of death into the garden life. The source of all blessings, of all living water in Genesis 2. And here Jacob is crossing the river, the Jabbok. He puts to death his old self. He's given a new name. He is Israel. He is one who has wrestled with God and has not given up the fight. Jacob wrestles with God, crosses over that river into new life. But what makes this good news is that Jacob is merely a foretaste of what is to come. Jacob represents what we all must experience and what must happen to us. But there was another who crossed his own river. Not as an allegory for what happens to us, but he crossed that river for us. You see, there was another person, another man who wrestled with God at night before crossing his own river. And the night before his crucifixion, Jesus wrestled with his Father. He said to his Father, "If it is possible, let this cup pass from me. I do not want to do this." He was so overcome and stricken with grief in his dark night of the soul that he sweat drops of blood. In his anguish, he wrestled with God because Jesus crossed that great river in his crucifixion. You know, the old spirituals would talk about crossing over Jordan into Canaan's fair land. The crossing of the Jordan was a metaphor for death. When I die and enter by and by, when I cross that river, you see, Jesus crossed his own river. Only for Jesus, death was not symbolic or representative. You see, Jesus crossed that river, hear this, church, not so that he would be made new, but so that we would be made new. Jesus did not avoid the difficult, the hard, the dark, but instead entered into it fully, knowing that on the other side of the river there was the resurrection. So, church, have you wrestled with God? Have you striven with God, or are you maybe instead avoiding the fight? Well, the good news is that in those moments, in the times when we find ourselves at the ford of the Jabbok, where we are confronted by God and therefore have to confront ourselves, the good news is that as we meet God there, we are not left there, but we are given a new name, a new way of being. We all have those rivers to cross, and the prime example for us crossing that river, entering those waters, is our baptism. One of the things we emphasize in our baptism is that we are participating in the death of Christ so that we might share in his resurrection. Baptism is a sacrament, a sacred moment, whereby as we enter into the waters, we enter into the grave with Christ, so that as we are brought out of the waters, we are brought up into his resurrected life. So this morning, as we reflect on the ford of the Jabbok and Jacob wrestling with God at the river's edge, we are reminded that he went through that water a changed person, and that we in our baptism have a transformation in our sharing in the death of Christ.